Okay, looks like recording's kicked off. So yeah, we'll kind of kick off this first working group meeting for Apostle. So yeah, thanks for hopping on, guys. I know it's early out in APAC region. We'll probably be doing a handful of these. Most of this will, again, kind of evolve as the next couple of versions drop. Since there'll be some new features, we can talk about that. That's kind of the metadata stuff, which is what I originally proposed. And this working group, I mean, the main goal, actually, here, let me share my screen. So hopefully my screen is showing up. So real quick, just so review for everyone, depending on what meetings and what you track in the community and what other meetings you've been on and whatnot. But basically, we have these two kind of types of groups. We have special interest groups, shorthand for SIGs, and then we have working groups. And SIGs are essentially our kind of long-living specific project efforts, such as around wallets and clients and SDKs and APIs and whatnot. And then working groups could be kind of long-running, but they're typically meant to be focused on a specific effort, and then maybe disband after a certain period of time after that work is done. So Apostle is kind of like the first one that kind of made sense to make that, as obviously there's version 1 of Apostle, and then there's a re-implementation of version 1 for Catapult. But obviously we want everyone to kind of rally together, discuss kind of what a version 2 could be like, whether or not it's 99% the same or slightly different, or a lot different, right? It doesn't really matter. Just kind of get the dialogue and get anyone who's interested in the community working on taking advantage of what new features are there now and what might come shortly here in the near future. So it's kind of one of our first working groups for the community. Basically, that's kind of a quick gist of the overview and the effort of the group. So I think, JT, you've been doing LuxTag work?
Yes, I'm actually working full-time with LuxTag.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, and then Yoka, I know you're kind of working with Sasaki and the Open Inline guys, and then you've worked on Open Apostle based on the current / first implementation of Apostle, at least API protocol wise. And then I know there's a few others, I think, from both kind of LuxTag sphere of direct people that either directly work for LuxTag. I know some other people have popped up and have given some input, and a few other interested people have commented on the thread. So I kind of reordered and kind of what seemed to be like a logical order of things. Actually, let me just, we'll cover it this way. Sorry, 1 second. So Doka, I know you had created this text summary and posted it and shared it with the group maybe a couple of weeks ago or something. So it's a nice kind of like summary of kind of how the first version functions. So people can kind of come here and take a look and get a quick gist without having to either read the old white paper or look through the code. As far as I understand, basically, and actually JT, I guess you can speak to this, the first, whoops, 1 second here. The first implementation, sorry, 1 second, my browser popped out. So let this reload. So the first implementation was essentially like a direct redo of the first one. or the first version, what's currently here in this repo. Is that correct?
Yes. So I think what we have done for Catapult is exactly. So that would include both private and public apostille.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, I mean, like a key distinction, which isn't always kind of discussed, is definitely actually, sorry, can you guys hold on 1 second? Apologies. Let me, 1 second here.
While Nate's doing that, what do you guys think about public versus private apostille? Should there be public, or should there be private, or should there be both going forward in Catapult? That was something that I always debated about. Any thoughts?
Yeah. I think that having the distinction between private and public apostille kind of makes it a bit more confusing, because most people think of apostille as the public apostille, and they don't, like, if you look in Nano Wallet, you can create both.
Mm-hmm.
The default one is public, and the one that you upload on Open Apostille with the certificate is also public. And so when people talk about non-fungible tokens or non-fungible assets, there is no linkage, and I think there's a bit of confusion there. And so
okay, Dalka, which one is your favorite on apostille, the public apostille or the private apostille?
Public apostille.
Yeah, you like public apostille?
Private apostille is difficult for many people.
Okay, good to know. Okay. Interesting. I'm thinking, Dalka, with the creation of aggregate transactions, it's actually maybe possible with an aggregate transaction to make every apostille a public and a private transaction. In the way that would be done is that the private transaction could be made to the private sync account, but the public transaction could be made to the public sync account, and then they're combined into one transaction. That maybe would give someone the best of both worlds if that's what they wanted, but I'm not sure if that's something that should be a part of the future protocol or not. Okay, so Nate, are you back?
Yeah. I've just been kind of here listening as you've been kind of proposing the topics and questions. Yes, I mean, so I guess, basically where we're kind of at, which is good, right? I mean, like there's this, I guess it's a prototype for under the LuxTag repo that is, targeted towards the new, based on the current / old API. And again, like I think most of these conversations, obviously the question isn't as much like how much do we want to change it? It's, hey, given the new tools that we have at our disposal that are currently there today, and then obviously the big one, which we can jump into in more detail with the metadata stuff coming down the pipeline, how do we want to kind of influence it, right? And it might just be, leveraging the metadata for some syntactic, sugar on top of what's kind of already done, but keep most of it the same. Or it might be, hey, we can actually like restructure. And I guess to your point, Jeff, of like, I think some old conversations we had around like, assets versus accounts and kind of where to hang data off and kind of have the ownership managed and how the metadata plays a role in that. Like the hope is that, the metadata stuff is decently talked about, the past, 4 or 5 months. It's, I would say somewhere between 75 and 90% there as far as its intention, kind of how it's going to shape up. So the hope is like, hey, and as we get to this last mile before like actually getting a first implementation into a release, there's really a couple efforts that will probably have the most influence. Apostille's one of them. Some other token related stuff will be another influencer with any final tweaks that we want to do before our first drop. So it's kind of like, in one way, you almost think of it as like a blank canvas, even though a lot of it's kind of, thought about already, and it's relatively flexible in its intent. But if there's other things that the people working on Apostille would like to see, then it's like, okay, maybe there's some tweaks, or maybe some intended tweaks. So it's like, we can't quite get there yet in this first drop. We'll implement it for a second drop. But that's again kind of what these meetings and
Nate, I have a question for you about metadata and about aliases, because aliases could also be used for makeshift metadata too, I think. But is metadata allowed to be applied to third-party accounts? Like, for instance, if you have an account and I have an account, and our private keys are completely separate, money's completely separate, everything's completely separate, am I allowed to put metadata on your account?
The current mindset is yes.
Okay.
So the current mindset is like I can apply a tag to someone's account, and some of that could be used. Like some of the driving use cases for that are like token and kind of compliance related tagging or KYC type scenarios. Those are kind of, let's think of those as kind of the leading use cases that are driving that. There's always going to be pluses and minuses. So a plus side is, hey, it's an open system, open blockchain, people can do stuff on it, right? And then of course the flip side, which people kind of bring up on the current V1 network is, hey, well, certain bad actors in the system can just spam my account then, right? And can be, and they can just like, quote unquote, fill up my account. So like again, none of this has been finalized, but the initial kind of design conversations are such that, well, don't prevent, because it kind of like, the thought is, if we start to restrict it where you have to basically allow people to tag your account, it starts to partially to significantly reduce the utility of metadata tags.
Okay.
One, you have to include the opposite person in a loop, right? Of approval. Second of all, in the case for someone like, again, let's just use the example again of like a KYC compliant type, token scenario. Well, I don't want you to assign a KYC value to my, I want to lie and say that I am from a country that I'm not from. And I don't want you to apply a tag that denotes me in a different country. So I'm just not going to allow that. Right. So you end up kind of getting, in the bad scenarios, this tussling of like people wanting and needing to use the feature. So some things that are driving that on the flip side is saying like, well, yes, there is a scenario where someone can just like kind of spam your account. Most of that, not to say there's no downsides, but most of those downsides are really going to be, and this is even without spamming. I feel that a good chunk of the downsides are going to be on the user experience. So if I have one tag versus 1,000 tags versus 50 tags versus 10 tags, whether they're spam or not, like I could have 150 tags that aren't spam, right? It's just through, I approved all 150 and the system is restricted. how do you want to present to the user those 150, right? The default is like you want to have some way to kind of categorize or group and search and filter based on the context that the user's at. So if I'm like looking at a certain token, I want tags that are kind of related, like assumed or known to be related to that token. If it's something that's apostille related, and I happen to be viewing the apostille plugin / an apostille asset, or document or file or whatever it is, it should filter just those metadata tags versus saying, oh, well, here's a bunch of tags, and if you scroll through them, some of those will be the apostille ones, right? So there's going to be different ways that are, it's going to end up having to be solved regardless through the user experience.
Right.
So again, that's the current mindset. Let's say it's not locked in. There's people that, reference stuff that happens on the current V1 network and some spammage from, mosaics and tagging and stuff that people are using now, and spammy polls and things that, of course, have popped up from certain bad actors. But that's the current mindset. And then, so actually, why don't we just kind of segue and jump in, since we're kind of drilling into metadata. This is kind of the core of what will influence. So these are kind of, if my screen's showing up, I'm on the improvement proposal. And there's kind of this table of kind of who can set and who can change. So any account can kind of set on these things, and then who can change or invalidate or expire. It's kind of like, essentially the originator, the creator. And then there's potentially some other things we can, introduce. But again, this is kind of the mindset of let's say, an open approach to this metadata. A key thing is this notion of kind of pruning. This is I wouldn't say a hot topic, but this is plus and minus topic that, again, people have, just like the open versus approval based metadata. People have some different ideas. So one idea is all tags for all time live in the system and on the blockchain for like historical reference. And then another mindset and mentality is no, like none of it lives on the blockchain, just the verification of the metadata lives on the blockchain. And maybe just the latest value exists in some store or cache, which in our current world would be on an API node and in Mongo. And then if a value were to change or expire, those values would be changed or ejected. The proof that a value existed in a different state at a point in time would still be there, but the system would not be responsible. So then, some people have brought up the notion of, again, audit and compliance and historical reference and whatever. And again, this is more of a philosophy of like, well, does it then make sense to actually build an add-on to allow people, that's kind of some stuff I had kind of brought up and, kind of proposed as like a default behavior is, well, if we have a default behavior of open metadata in regards to history, audit, and pruning, maybe a default behavior is to prune everything on change or expiration, and the blockchain stores no historical record except for latest version. And then we could enable, hey, if you enable audit control for your network, you can actually maintain full audit capability. And most of that would come into play on private networks. Most likely it would not hit on the public network just due to storage constraints, or it could be, hey, keep the last 3 or something like that. You'll see certain audit systems in place, like, hey, keep the last 3 versions of this file, right? Like you'll see that in cloud storage systems and other database setups.
Is this happening through receipts then? If it's on the Mongo, the state of the metadata, then how do we know that it's actually been secured cryptographically?
That value would live in the blocks. So you could prove, let's just magically say that a certain tag has gone through like 4 variants, and I want to prove, let's say I just wrote it down on a piece of paper. Hey, I sent this tag to Jeff at this point in time. And I write it down on a piece of paper and shove it in my desk. And then like a year later, the tag's like changed to 4 different things. And then you're having a discussion. I'm like, no, Jeff, like literally I can go pull out the piece of paper and like it existed in the state, and I'm going to prove it because I'm going to go to the block that existed at that point in time. And I'm going to pull out the basically the kind of, you know, signed hashed value. And I will assert that this key value pair is indeed that value. And I can assert that and prove it. You know, typically a lot of these things are always going to be for like audit/conflict resolution, right? In a lot of kind of blockchain scenarios. So then again, this reflects back on the solution at hand, which is, oh, well, that's nice, but do we really want people to like write down on a piece of paper or like copy paste into some separate file? So then it becomes like, okay, well, you know, the system should store on the side off chain, because in theory tags, you know, we're going to have to enforce some limit on metadata tags for size just inherently. But then you say like, well, again, maybe there's some fast moving tag that's changing quite a bit. Do you really want to store all those values? And then like, does it make sense? It's just going to be chain bloat. And at the end of the day, if really it's just for provability of state at a given time, you don't care about that. And so, again, it's kind of more, you know, different philosophies, but from a conservative scaling approach, you know, the default behavior would be, by default, the system doesn't store history. It only stores the latest version, and that is not stored on chain, that's stored off chain. The only thing that's on chain in the blocks in the headers is the actual like provable, like signed, you know, values versus the values themselves. So if I have a little X character blob, that's my value, that exists somewhere. And again, that's where we were kind of going back and forth in some early conversations on, yeah, but you know, for compliance, you know, especially if we're talking about security tokens, you know, having a history of contract values, and it's kind of like, well, let's weight this back down into normal database land. Let's forget blockchains. Like, let's say I'm using a relational database to store this stuff. In a normal databases do not store history for you. You have to implement that, right? You have to write it in your app, and like on model, on record change, your ORM has to persist into an audit table. And then there's some ORMs that you can like flip on flags and it will like start auditing for you. Kind of get some of that, but that's always done outside the database. Now, some other databases will have certain versioning and kind of audit controls kind of built in. I know there's some Postgres add-ons and plugins and extensions and things and some other databases, but by default, most databases do not store all versions of all history for all time. If they're an append-only database, something like Redis, you can turn that on and it will do something like that, but that's not for historical reference. That's just the way that their data structure is managed. So again, kind of some of the mentality is like, well, why don't we just kind of take the same approach, and then it's up to the network to decide, well, how big and bloated do I want my blockchain? Some are really going to want to. They're like, no, this is really important. I want to store full history. Other ones will be like, I don't really care. I'm just going to store history off in some other data store. It's just going to be some random key value store. I don't even know what it is. I'm just going to write that into my app or service. And so these are things that obviously are will have an effect. If you talk about apostille leveraging, versioning of documents or whatever is being, going in. And if that stuff turns into metadata tags and you say, what's the full history of the values? How do you want that stored? And the answer might be, we want full audit history. And when the eventual, public chain goes, we want that to be turned on. That's obviously more of a discussion on the philosophy of how the new public network should be managed and size-wise and performance. And, just like all the harvesting conversations, like these are kind of network-specific conversations about how people want to set up harvesting and fees. How do you want to set up like auditing and like sizing and storage of data, right? And metadata, I mean, the hope is we can just include these knobs, and then you just, per your network, you just configure it, and when it's running, it behaves in this manner.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah.
So yeah, it definitely has an effect, but it's we're trying to make it restrictive by default, but through configuration, you can kind of open it up. Again, that's the current goal, but we're not we haven't gotten into any of that level of implementation yet. But again, that's kind of, I look at it as mostly a user experience and a developer experience problem versus actually a functional problem.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess kind of along these lines with metadata and some of the, Doka had kind of posted this apostille asset repo and shared it with the group. We get, okay. So, and again, Jeff, I know like we've briefly in the past talked about it, and then you brought up a few times is, kind of how some of this might change, right, based on how metadata. So I don't know if you guys have immediate values based on what Doka's published or your own thinking over the past few weeks. Obviously, it's been kind of like light conversation as everyone's just been kind of busy doing stuff, and we're kind of waiting for these features to unfold. But you guys have any particular immediate thoughts, feelings, questions besides ones we've already been kind of digging into?
I'll just mention that I'm super excited about all these features coming out on Catapult, account properties, metadata, aggregate transactions, and basically my mind's having a hard time trying to narrow down all the different great things that we could do. So I definitely want to improve the protocol, but I would love to hear what other people have for suggestions, and I'm quite flexible and open. But I'm confident that we can do a lot better than what we've done in IS1.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, of course, it's like, you have a certain tool set at your disposal and you kind of make use of it, and use or abuse of it, right? And, that's what everyone's kind of done, not just Apostille, but any implementation on top of V1. And actually even V2, there's going to be, it's more powerful and it's going to be more flexible, but, there's going to be some uses and abuses of the design patterns and the objects that are at hand and the transaction types. The hope is that metadata will provide enough flexibility and enough functionality such that it's kind of becomes kind of the Swiss Army knife. So at one level, it's just metadata tagging. At another level, it's like schema extensions. So like a good example is a description field. Instead of having like a formalized description field, you could just have a default notion of a description key that hangs off of a asset, and that becomes the description value. And then now that you've done that for description, you can now create kind of schemaed objects, whether you have, one of them or n of them. So there's some other specifics that have been talked about, such as along the, like what JT kind of had mentioned, is, when you start bringing up the subject of like non-fungible tokens, of course, where you have, I have a billion of these, but I want to uniquely identify them. There's inherent like, in theory, you could, conversations. Actually, these are really old conversations of like, well, apply single within the message, apply an additive metadata tag that can be associated to that single asset, and it lives with it no matter where it goes. These are other types of things that have been brought up, but obviously there's performance behavior and characteristics. That again, more conversations.
Yeah, I almost think that it might be like Ethereum has ERC20, ERC23, ERC 721, that we might even want to try to just get a few different standards that Apostille 1, Apostille 2, Apostille 3, that are clearly defined and that meet the needs, instead of trying to find a one size fits all. It might be better to think of 2 or 3 maybe, and define those out, and then let people pick from them, depending on, and that's kind of what we've done with Apostille anyway. Apostille 1 is public, Apostille 2 is private, but that was a very, very basic difference. We might want to think about getting a few different versions for Catapult.
Okay, yeah, actually, let me add some notes.
So I think the most simple one, if we were going to make multiple standards, would be to just do the NIS1 apostille standard, which is kind of what LuxTag already did, with the most obvious simple improvements. Like instead of doing 3 transactions, we do an aggregate transaction, obviously, right? I mean, just keep apostille version 1 would be, keep it as simple to the NIS1 with doing the obvious improvements, and then maybe come up with a second and a third standard. Because really, there's just so many, possibilities that trying to fit it all into one just doesn't exactly make sense. I know that Dalka has his, Alish did his. I have some ideas. I mean, I think it's so awesome that Catapult, that it's creating a new problem of being overwhelmed with possibilities. So,
Yeah. And again, I mean, some of this might be where prototype, again, there's kind of like potentially, a couple designs, and then those just be, potentially groupings and scripted variants within a single SDK that can then be just, you load different versions, right? You say, oh, I want to create a apostille type 1, apostille type 2, and things can go from there. And then of course things, actually another discussion point is, legacy support. Right. So like if we are, again, that's a highly related but kind of separate conversation where, there's conversations about like, oh, well, how's the launch of the new network going to go? We're going to, like the current seems, I haven't been keeping tabs on the latest, but, the latest last time I were like a couple of weeks ago, it was kind of like, well, maybe we'll snapshot kind of high level state, not all the details, but just assets and balances and accounts and things, and then generate a new big, Nemesis block in the new network that is the basis of that state and won't be all the historical history. So then the question becomes, how does that affect the migration of apostille v1? And if it affects it detrimentally based on the decisions that are made for the v2 network, then there is no migration, right? There's like, okay, apostille v1 is not going to migrate with, because there's certain data that has been decided will not be migrated, right? I know, again, I don't know what the latest are the past few weeks. I just know some of the points people were bringing up that would potentially affect whether or not legacy support would be needed. But this will also be, reflected in, to your point of, well, maybe there are a couple versions of the new implementation, and then whether or not to support the old version if it's going to be around, right? If it is around, then it's like, oh, hey, I can pull up in a single, client app setup, both like old apostille documents and things I've put in there as well as new ones. So those are kind of like open questions.
Yeah, I think that for us to, I'm not personally planning on with LuxTag that there's going to be a full snapshot of all the data in Catapult. It seems to be that would be kind of hard. And if there's not a full snapshot of all messaging, then apostille in NIS1 doesn't carry over. But I'm coming up with a contingency plan, which would be for any companies that wanted to migrate data over. They could essentially make a bot that would spam out messages and the history kind of manually. And then whenever someone was using the app, it would redirect them back to the Catapult chain, and then they would re-sign, basically verifying, and then carry on the certificate on Catapult. I'm not doing a very good job explaining it, but in my head, it makes sense.
Yeah, I think I kind of followed a high level of you kind of have just back reference to different systems, kind of like having 2 different databases, and you maintain the old one, and new data goes in the new one. but you have some refs back to the old one and you can just talk to it or whatever, right? Again, some of these things end up manifesting as, a little bit of actual implementation, but, definitely like a UX issue about how users would be presented with certain things, right?
Goes back to the user experience.
Yeah. That's good. So yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think kind of like lightweight, focus kind of discussion as far as where things are at now. At a high level, we still don't know where metadata is going to fall. It's not going to fall. Dragon is really focused on a little bit more like underlying, let's call it, stability / move some moving parts under the covers, which don't really change functionality. It's more catching up to some of the previous, both for Bison and Cow, like revs and stuff that were going on that left some changes under the covers that need to be updated. So Dragon will be more weighted towards that. There is a chunk of, I don't know to what extent, but some early metadata prototyping was done last year when we were making back then a lighter weight version of it with not quite as extensible functionality. And then we kind of tabled it. And then as we revisited it and got more input, it was kind of like, okay, then we can actually everyone wants it, but so let's keep delaying it while we get some of these other core pieces done. So that's kind of, the hope is maybe Elephant will be the first, place where it kind of comes in, which will be a couple months out, but we'll see. Again, the devs have been kind of working, they're kind of like ahead of the curve in such that, for instance, Cow came out and they actually snuck some Dragon stuff into Cow. And then they've been doing some dot releases, which are still kind of under the third Cow release. So they already dropped the stabilizing one last week and posted those images. So there'll be some other stuff that's falling out. And then we'll know in a little bit kind of when stuff will be officially Dragon. And then from there we will kind of dial in what the targets are for next major new items, of which metadata is well top of the list. So in the meantime, I guess it's kind of just continuous conversations. Again, like we can kind of do these meetings as needed. It was good. This is a bit of a delay. We've been talking for a few weeks about getting one of these on the books. So it was good to at least get one and start the conversation. So, whether or not we do another one next week or the week after or whenever, just like if you guys have been on other calls and meetings, just bring conversation and comments to the Slack. So if people are thinking, like, for instance, like Jeff, like your point of like, hey, maybe we have kind of like a couple independent, even though maybe a high degree of overlap under the covers, implementations that kind of target stuff. It's like that dialogue can kind of happen. And then as stuff, as people post things, whether it's just notes or it's actual like reference implementations, we can kind of like, people can participate, give feedback, and then we can, schedule more of these meetings as needed and then kind of go from there. And again, kind of just see who else. We know obviously LuxTag folks, Doka, like you and your guys are obviously highly interested in it. We'll see kind of who else is.
Asta's interested, but I forgot to tell them to come because they have Copyright Bank, which is using Apostille 2, and there's at least 3 or 4 other projects that are doing it. I'm not sure if they're aware of these meetings right now, so we'll have to get the word out to them and see what they say.
Yeah. Again, it's kind of just we can spread the word, and then anyone who's interested, either in both coding or in actually just providing feedback and stuff. And again, like I think part of this is using this group as a hard final input as well as sanity check on how the metadata stuff's gonna like fall out. It's kind of like there will become a point of like speak now or hold your peace for a couple of releases. And that time will be coming in the not too distant future. So it's kind of like getting everyone kind of pushing the limits now, asking the right questions on the feature set for obviously specifically for metadata, as well as anything else that might pop out of other improvement proposals that get posted. Yeah, in the meantime, we can kind of just continue the conversation on Slack, and however else, if people are posting stuff, just, share links at a minimum, and then people can kind of review and ask questions, and then we can organize more of these meetings as needed.
Yep. Okay. I think that for me personally, I have a lot on my plate, so I won't have anything new to offer in a week from now, or probably even 2 weeks. So I think I would be okay with having meetings later. I don't know about Jonathan or Galka, how quickly we want to move on this.
I think. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I feel that a lot of it is also dependent on how the metadata implementation comes out. So I don't know, if there is not much activity going on in that NIP, then I think there's not much point going ahead in another meeting that soon.
Okay. Dalka?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, like that definitely makes sense. And then we can, some of it, there's kind of, in my mind, there's two, like one kind of logical and one implementation, right? So there's a logical of like, hey, the specs kind of dialed in for how metadata is going to behave, and assume it's going to be functional in this manner. And then there's the, it's now implemented in some beta form and can actually be used in certain test builds or whatever. So a good example is what Alish had done with non-fungible assets like last year. And then he had actually picked it back up. He hasn't been actively working on it in the past maybe like a month or two. He did pick it back up and kind of poke at it a little bit to kind of do some updates. But and so some of the conversations there were like, okay, there's no formal way to do non-fungible assets. So he just started implementing like this wrapper layer that used the tools at hand, right? Or abused the tools at hand that were there. And the conversations were like, oh, well, actually, what we can do is actually like stabilize the interface, even though the functionality might be swapped out under the covers. So like where you're doing N messages with like embedded, truncated, like packed JSON data into those messages to do your non-fungible asset, when metadata or something else comes out that is going to be leveraged, the interface at the SDK level looks the same, and then you're just swapping out the implementation. So instead of packing up an aggregate with 6 messages, it's still an aggregate, but instead of messages, it's metadata transactions or whatever, right? So that's where some of this, if we know in 2 or 3 weeks or whatever that like, hey, speak now or don't speak for at least version 2 or Rev 2 on the metadata, then we'll essentially lock in and say, this is what it's going to look like. Then, the conversations can continue around, well, should we start doing implementations that abstract to, messages just to kind of get through the exercise of seeing how things might function. For the non-fungible stuff, it seemed to make sense, and Alicia had kind of pushed that way. For this, it might or might not. Again, these are conversations we can have. But so we'll kind of have those two kind of hurdles. And, the devs will be coming up for air in a little bit, maybe in the next few weeks as some of these up under the covers stabilizing updates. Again, we just dropped a dot release last week. So maybe another week or two, and we'll get like a snapshot update of like how things are going to time out for Dragon and how big of a bite will we chew off for the first metadata pass. So all that conversation will be going on, and everyone kind of chime in, and we'll be posting stuff on the Slack. So yeah. Oh, and actually, one other thing I guess I'll mention. Discussion. Cow readiness for. So, Cal had the big changes of, separating namespaces and mosaics, and a few other tweaks. There's some, most of the stuff's is working now. There's a couple last transactions. So another thing, it's not fully, it's not like required, but like just a consideration is, doing a sanity check just to make sure. I know there's, as of this morning, I think there's, so we just posted the latest. We haven't announced it yet because we're waiting on one or two more fixes. Those are on some locked transactions, which aren't relevant to Apostille. But anyways, just more kind of testing and verification, right? So if there's things that you guys are kind of like playing with, it's just kind of like, hey, make sure it works on Bison. Hey, Cal's now kind of generally available. And we're going to be iterating on it. So that's just one other point I forgot to bring up earlier. So we'll be announcing, again, it's there now. But we haven't announced anything. We're waiting to see if this last fix, what we think is the last fix at the SDK level will be pushed possibly late tonight, US time, technically tomorrow, EU time. So anyways, just more stuff for you guys to think about with the current implementation.
And then we think that the JavaScript SDK for Cal should be basically up to date when that push comes out. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah. So like 90x% of the features that are there now. I think there was one hash lock issue, and then there's one issue that's either related to that they were conversating about this morning. Because basically I was updating the tags for the images and the Bootstrap deployment tool. And they're like, oh, well, hold off on announcing it. I was like, well, I've already applied the tags. I've already pushed the commits. The images have already been published. And so we were like, okay, we'll just wait to see. It's kind of like, well, it'd be nice to have all the features in. There's some updates to the docs that David wanted to get done. So he's like, hey, let's hold off for like a day. So possibly tomorrow, there'll be some stuff. So there's something related to fees as well. There's a conversation going on the, I think in the API channel, conversation on fees. So some of that was reflected in the same stuff. And then even if there's bugs or little other tweaks, those will just drop in dot releases. We're trying to get, not everyone is using like, hash locks or fee stuff right now, but goal is to get it like as functional as possible while still allowing people like, hey, let's get something out sooner than later so people can start to do some of the basic send hey, I want to send an asset. I want to create an asset, right? Like that's the majority of what people are kind of caring about doing. So anyways, that's just one more little update. And there'll be more drops coming most likely in the subsequent weeks. Most of those will be at the SDK and REST server layer potentially, but seems like REST server got a couple tweaks and updates in the drop today. And then server was updated last week. And it probably will be updated again maybe in a couple of weeks before the bigger Dragon release. So yeah, other stuff to be mindful of. So cool. I guess any other kind of questions or stuff on your guys' end?
Nope.
Nothing here. Yeah. I do think it's a good idea to start to think about different versions of Apostille instead of one. And, I'm thinking that Apostille version 1 would be very simply just the old standard public Apostille, and Apostille version 2 would be the old standard private Apostille. And then we could start to think about Apostille version 3 or 4 to meet different needs. I think that would be a good way to start off. Maybe, I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds good. And definitely it's a good approach, right? Again, we kind of have this little window of time, whether it's a couple of weeks or whatnot, that these types of things, these conversations can be had and people can make notes and stuff and little design kind of write-ups, get everyone's feedback, and just everyone can kind of start coalescing these ideas. And whether or not they stay independent or they merge into just different variants of the same implementation, that can organically just be figured out as things move along. So that all sounds pretty good.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yep.
Definitely.
Cool. But yeah, thanks everyone for hopping on, taking the time, and we'll see everyone on Slack.
All right. Have a good day. Thank you, Nate.
Right. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.